Hello, and welcome to The Road Less Traveled, 3 decades of progressive mental health leadership in Oregon. My name is Sarah Smith, and I will be the moderator today on behalf of David Oakes, who set up this MindFreedom Oregon quarterly meeting. And I'm really excited about the topic today. The Road Less Traveled, 3 decades of progressive mental leadership in Oregon is set up as an interview by Kevin Fitz of Bob Nikkel. And I will read their biographies to you in a moment. But before I do, I just want to go over a few guidelines for this 60-minute event. Your questions are welcome, but please use the question and answers function. Please use chat for brief networking with each other, and please be civil. And I am now going to read a biography of Kevin Fitz. Let's see. Okay. All right, Kevin, Bob Nikkel is an advocate. I'm going to start with Bob. Bob Nikkel is an advocate for peer respect and meaningful involvement in mental health and addiction programs at all levels of the system. For 6 years, he served as Oregon's mental health commissioner. Bob is writing a history of progressive movements in Oregon's mental health history with a major focus on peer supports and services. Kevin Fitz, who will be conducting the interview, is the executive director for Oregon Mental Health Consumers Association. And Kevin also serves as a State of Oregon Consumer Advisory Council, State of Oregon Addictions and Mental Health Planning and Advisory Committee, Unity Center for Behavioral Health Advisory Committee, Multnomah County Adult Mental Health and Substance Abuse Advisory Council Executive Committee, and a Home for Everyone Coordinating Council. He's on the board of the Oregon Consumer Survivor Coalition, OCSC. MindFreedom is the state affiliate for MindFreedom International, an independent coalition for human rights and alternatives in the mental health system. And to get on the email alert system for MindFreedom,
Thank you. It's actually an honor to be here. I don't know that I can live up to all of the things you said about me, but I've always been trying to do my best. So thank you.
Very good. Very good. Well, where should we start here, Bob? We said we're going to 3 decades. Why don't you take us to start us off here and give us some early history, or what do you want to lead with, Bob?
Well, I did a little research for the topic, and what I found out was that in England, there was something called the Lunatic Friends Society. And it was formed in England, as I said, in the middle of the 19th century. It created self-help groups. Same thing kind of happened in Germany. In 1868, I'm reading some notes here, Mrs. Elizabeth Packard published the first of several books and pamphlets in which she detailed her forced commitment. So if we think this is something new, we just need to realize we've got a lot of history behind us. And so I thought that was a good thing to note. Yeah, Kevin and I met, I think probably in 1990. We may have met a little bit before that, but I was sort of tricked into being the mental health commissioner, and I'll get to that story after a little bit. But the state wanted me to come to work for them, and they wanted me to develop acute care units in hospitals rather than the state hospital. And that seemed like a worthwhile thing to do. They said, by the way, we've got this other program that we're doing. We're going to train people to be case managers, and then we're going to assign them the most difficult patients to discharge. And all of the case managers are going to be people who've been there themselves. And I thought, wow, if the state's crazy enough to try something like that, I might fit in for a while. So, excuse me. I did. I went through several different positions there. In 2003, Barry Cast, who had hired me originally, told me he wanted me to be the new mental health commissioner. And I said, I'm not going to do that. To make a long story short, he said, do it for 3 months and we'll find somebody. And in 3 months, he came in and said, you're it. So that's kind of how I got into this kind of unusual job. That's not anything that I ever aspired to. But the neat thing was that I met Kevin, I met Mike Libacek, I met Scott Snedecor, I met another guy named Dave Edwards. We always referred to as State Dave Edwards, who we really appreciated too. And so those were some of the things that we did. And the project actually got national and international recognition. The U.S. Surgeon General's report in 1986, 1986, actually highlighted us as one of the early, as they said, consumer, we would probably say peer programs in the country. So I'm not sure we were really the first one, but I thought that was a really kind of a good thing that came out of it. One of the first things that I did when I got into the position was that I started the Consumer Advisory Council. It's now in state law, so I feel that it's received some recognition and stability, and there's some structure to it. The whole idea was that people who'd been in services didn't have any place where I could just talk to them without anybody interfering with me. So we did that. We covered a lot of territory. One of my favorite stories about David, and he wanted me to be sure to tell this story, was after one particularly arousing session, and he said it was probably about the oppressive nature of the system. It was pretty raucous, and David is just a great guy. I really have appreciated him for many years. But I got a call from him in the evening, and he said, "Hey, Bob, are we still friends, and do you still love me?" And I said, "Of course, David. That to me, that's a real honor for me to be able to have David in my life. I've learned a lot too since that time, and I think I should mention that the last 10 or 11 years, I've worked a lot with Robert Whitaker. And I've gotten to know even more people who are advocates. And I think I've come a little ways since then, hopefully a long ways, because I'm much more skeptical that we're on the right track with mental health. I think we're way over medicating people. I think we're way over diagnosing people. I think we're way over restricting people. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to somebody. They were actually asking me if I'd be in the next governor's administration. And the answer to that is hell no. But it got me thinking about if I were to do things differently now, what would I do? I came up with 18 things. I went for a walk, and that number came back to 52. And if any of you would like to see it at some point, I'd be happy to share it, because it really is strongly influenced by what's happened to me in the last 10, 15, even 20 years.
So are these 52 different things that you would do if you became the next behavioral health administrator, Bob?
Well, this is one of my pet ideas, if you will. I would put into administrative rule that people being prescribed medications had to be given full and complete informed consent. Right now, if you get prescribed, and you're told anything, you're taking what I call neuroleptics, not antipsychotics anymore. But if you're taking neuroleptics, they might tell you could get tardive dyskinesia. But they don't tell you things like what are all the other effects that you could experience. And I won't try to go into all of those right now. But they also don't tell you what it would take to go off those medications. And I think that's a legitimate thing to tell people who take them, because most people, if you read the long-term and medium-term outcome research, Martin Harrow at University of Chicago School of Medicine, you'll begin to see that basically not everybody, some people really do need to take these neuroleptics long-term, but most people, if they can get off them, do better. And so the whole idea that that one needs to be told something about what it would take to go off the medications, I think is important. So and the other thing is that, as I mentioned, the outcome data is not all that good. And I think for antidepressants and antipsychotics, neuroleptics, we need to be more honest about that. And, Bob Whitaker and I have talked a lot about this. We're not anti-medication. It's not that it should never be used. There's a time and place for it, and some people probably need it longer than others. But the whole idea of informed consent is something that's completely glossed over. I don't know anybody who's talking about it.
I wonder regarding the subject, and I think I agree. I think there's a significant amount of research that already exists up to this point. I don't, even if we stop doing research on this issue. However, I do think that there's a distinct difference between what the jobs program for pharmaceutical lobbyists and selling pills at $30, $28 each, whatever they cost, is a very lucrative and profitable model. So even if there is, some leadership and says, I want to go this direction, I wonder whether there'll be necessary political will by the rest of our lawmakers to move this across the finish line. Every time something like this gets brought up, the people in the psych survivor community gets painted as, as Scientologists or people who are anti-science or whatever, and given the megaphone and the power that and feel heard that you're going to be able to make, with effective civic engagement, because it's just you're taking on a Goliath of sorts with an awful lot of powerful financial tools at its hand to change the debate. I think that's very important. I think fundamentally, one of the things that I wish, if you were the next behavioral health commissioner, is make a redoubled commitment to actually hear the voice of the actual service user. We have gotten away from that, particularly in Oregon, in just of our language, where now if you have a lived experience, whether or not it's in public services, whether or not you've ever been civilly committed or had forced treatment, that you get to weigh into the debate of what the experience is of being an Oregon Health Plan public mental health customer. And those roles are now being filled by peer contractors of the state. Like I said, and you said earlier, there's a lot of great things to be said about the peer movement, but the peer contractor does not represent the voice of the individual user who's not also an employee of the system. And somewhere those 200,000 of us on the Oregon Health Plan who are not paid peer service providers, our voice has been swept away in the new language dance of semantics of how we identify ourselves. And I think it's a tragedy because we're not hearing for those people in the lower 20% of the socioeconomic sector who are being terribly ravaged by significant side effects of huge amounts of psychiatric drugs. I mean, and I know, we know people who are on 6-7 different psychiatric drugs a day, a cocktail. I think that's unconscionable. Hey, can I take you back a little bit to the Mind Empowered? Yes. That you were talking about, that federally recognized project?
Yeah, definitely.
Where were you working in a clinical setting before you became familiar what the Mind Empowered's case management program was trying to attempt to do?
Well, I became aware of the Mind Empowered when I met Garrett Smith. And I don't remember exactly when I met him, but Garrett was really the person who made the Mind Empowered go. Jerry Wang was also involved. And I don't know if anybody remembers Jerry Wang's name, but he deserves some recognition too.
Certainly.
I had been running a National Institute of Mental Health dual diagnosis demonstration project. And that's when I met Garrett. And this is telling on myself a little bit, but Garrett was going to be the data collector, the person collecting the data, because this is a research type project. And they told me a little bit about Garrett, and they said, well, he's a recovering alcoholic and he's had bipolar disorder. And I thought, oh, geez, how is this going to work? This guy's going to be unstable. Garrett was one of the most wonderful people Kevin, you and I have ever met. He had actually had a master's degree in business administration. He had been in recovery for a long time from both kinds of issues. And so I was in kind of a quasi-clinical role those last 3 years before I went to work for the state.
Yeah. So it's an amazing program where the one side took individuals who had the experience of severe mental health challenges, and then also were legitimately qualified mental health professionals providing intensive case management for those who the system, I don't like these terms, labeled non-compliant, difficult to treat, frequent flyers, all those sort of things. And then right out of the get out, compared and contrasted that consumer survivor case management team with, case managers without such life experience, and was a very meaningful experience working for the corporation at the time, but not working for that project. It was interesting to see the discriminatory attitudes that people had of like, oh, this person has been civilly committed for, psychotic issues, or this person's been a horrible, skid row alcoholic. How in the world could they provide equitable services, to these, folks who have these greatest needs? That was a very powerful lesson for me as an early advocate early on. Hey, you must have been back then. When did you first meet and become familiar with David Oakes and the Support Coalition? And tell us a little bit what you've learned about Support Coalition and now MindFreedom.
Yeah, I don't know. David has been part of the world that I've been in, whether directly or not, for decades. I don't really remember the first time I even heard his name, but it's at least 3 decades ago. And again, I wasn't sure if he was one of the anti-psychiatry folks where you couldn't really even talk to him about, things that, needed to be talked about. Well, it turns out he is very approachable. And I think that story I just told you about him calling me up is a good example of who David was and is. He's one of the heroes in my book. So I think he opened my mind a lot to as I said earlier, the oppressive nature of things like civil commitment. And again, I should just tell a story. We had a guy with a mental health problem in our neighborhood this morning. He had a gun. He was threatening to kill people. And there was a SWAT team out here and they had to take him into custody. And I don't know, sometimes there's not another choice. I hope once they got him there, they began to get out of the power struggle with him, because that's not going to lead anywhere. But, there are times, in my opinion, where we've got to do something. And that's part of what it is sometimes.
Certainly. I sometimes run into conflict with some of my friends. I think even the Supreme Court draws a distinction between temporary detainment, geographical containment, and then on top of that, forced psychiatric chemical treatment by giving you an injection or forcing you to take medications. And I think those are two different. I completely agree that we need at sometimes to restrict a person's civil liberties of movement for their own safety or others. But the rest of it about how we treat that and what we say about what's going on with them and order medical procedures, that's where I run into issues of civil rights and informed consent that I think are weak and anemic. Speaking of David and this project Mind and Power that started in the early 90s or late 80s, actually, in Portland. And I met him coming back. People know about the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. I went to a National Alliance for the Mentally Ill convention in 1990 in San Francisco. It's going to be called the Decade of the Brain. And I met an eminent is not the right word, but a very well-known psychiatrist named E. Fuller Torrey. And I was all about trying to research that and understand his theories of psychotic disorder and schizophrenia. And then 3 months later at Mind Empowered, I met David Oakes, and no one had exposed me to some of the other sides of, well, psychiatric medications might cause some impact of stabilizing or cooling off some of the mind and some of the thoughts, but it also can have a deleterious effect on your pancreas, your kidney, your liver. And why shouldn't somebody choose a direction towards wellness instead of being forced into that? That was all really important things that I heard from David. I was told by psychiatrists that David was radical and they couldn't be trusted because they worked from outside the system. And if you wanted to make any change within Oregon, you need to work within the public mental health system with the leaders and the current medical folks. And even though they said that, I sort of thought Mind Empowered and all of it, what it did was kind of an outpost for people who didn't buy into that mainstream religion. And here we are 34 years later, and we're still up against some of these same particular issues. Maybe you say I'm saying too much, but watching you from the sidelines in the state administration, and even when you weren't the administrator or the deputy administrator, you were very involved in the Office of Consumer Technical Assistance. Tell us a little bit about what that was and why Oregonians, people interested in the psychiatric history of leadership, the Office of Consumer Technical Assistance that you and Garrett Smith put together, on his leaving advocacy and retiring.
Well, my memory for that is maybe not as good as yours, Kevin. So in a little bit, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you and have you talk a little bit more about the details of what you guys actually did. But, I think it's pretty explanatory. Office of Consumer Technical Assistance. And you guys were there providing some support and some ideas and consultation for programs that are out there trying to do more of the right things. So maybe you can say a little bit more.
Yeah,
about
in 1997, the state of Oregon put out a grant RFP for $350,000 a year with mainly two objectives. One, to engage the consumer survivor. We weren't saying peer back then, but you could say that. To engage the consumer survivor in policy activities at the regional level, at the county level, at the state level, and federal level, and particularly educating them about opportunities where their voice could be heard to help impact these systems that were antiquated and based on institutional and force, to engage the consumer population and help educate them and provide them with technical assistance on how to get involved with things like the Consumer Advisory Council that you ended up creating. And then secondary along encouraging and engaging folks in policy as stakeholders and real stakeholders of the system. Fundamentally, what I think is the most important is the customer, the consumer. And then second along with that was the goal of developing mutual self-help processes, supporting mutual self-help groups, and developing consumer-run drop-in centers across the state. And that when we started that, and you gave us that project, or we won that grant, we started out, I think there were 2 or 3 of them at the time that grant was up for renewal in 2001. We had 36 consumer-run drop-in centers. Now, some of them were attached to a larger mental health clinic, but there were some significant ones like the Mind Empowered, like SAFE in Eugene, that Drake Eubank and others ran, that were completely independent. And 2000 and 2001, we had, compared to what we have now, because the Office of Consumer Technical Assistance supporting and leading those development of those, we had a robust community consumer survivor drop-in center ecosystem all across the state. And now we have nothing like that. We have maybe 2 or 3 clubhouse models, and those have meaning and do particular stuff around work, but those aren't consumer survivor run drop-in and community centers. And we probably have less than 3 or 4 of them, which is very unfortunate. That all, it seemed to be the golden years. I mean, even though we had friction, but some of those things I think were phenomenal, that your administration you were connected with support. It was also, at the state, in the early 90s, the state decided they wanted to support funding for a statewide network called the Oregon Consumer Network Incorporated. And that, and that was before the Office of Consumer Technical Assistance. And that ran into, how do people run a board of directors? How do we expect these people who come from these extreme circumstances of trauma and abuse? How do they learn how to be effective nonprofit, business partners and run these things effectively? And so a lot of those lessons were learned by mistakes. But that was something early on that the state of Oregon administration supported in the early 90s. And then, of course, your support of the Oregon Consumer Advisory Council, that was an informal group under your administration that became, state law in the 2010 era. So one of the things that I think about is, where do we go if we're trying to unify people? Where do we go if people see us or we're too far on the left or too far on the right, too far? And in this issue, sometimes people who think, oh, you're pro-force, you want to lock us up, you want to detain us, you want to force medicate, I can't deal with you. And then other people say, if you don't believe that there's a role for civil commitment, then you're outside the system and you're not legit. How do we bring some common ground into that discussion, particularly around every psychiatrist in the state worth his salt can read the research and say, significant troublesome stuff, long-term studies. How do we bring together a community that can find some middle ground and make some progress instead of just the polarity that we see?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I think one of the resources is probably Madden America. Bob Whitaker. Bob
What
is
for those who don't know who Bob Whitaker is, tell us a little bit more about who Bob Whitaker is.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to throw David Oakes into this too real quick. Bob Whitaker is an investigative medical journalist. He's worked for the Boston Globe. He's been at some of the top tiers, but he started getting interested in mental health issues partly because he ran into who David Oakes was. I don't know if people realize that David was a major influence on Bob. He ended up, because of that, writing the book Madden America. And its account is not a very pretty account of how people who have been described as mad, sometimes self-described, which is fine, have been treated in this country. It's not a bedtime book. It's a pretty difficult book. From that, he began to do even more research, and he started looking at research that led to him writing Anatomy of an Epidemic. I read that, and I'm not sure how I got onto it within about a month of his publishing it. And, I was so taken by it. The whole idea there, and this is oversimplification, was that if psych drugs were really the answer to mental health problems, if they really restored chemical imbalances, why has the disability rate gone up dramatically? And the more drugs are prescribed, the more the disability rate goes. So, and again, he's not saying all drugs are bad all the time, but it's raising a major question. So Anatomy of an Epidemic is a major reading. If anybody hasn't read it, I'd really encourage you to get, but I'll bet most of the people who are listening in on this have read it. I emailed him just thanking him. I said, your book hit me in the side of the head. And never expecting to hear back from him. I got an answer within about 2 days, and that's typical of Bob. He gets hundreds of emails, and I don't know how he keeps up with it all. But we brought him out here to Oregon 3 or 4 times. So Bob is a major influence. I think he's the leading progressive reformer. And sometimes people think he's not radical enough. But Bob and I have talked about that. Often we feel that if we post something and we get criticism from both sides, we're probably leaning more toward the side that we're talking to now. But, we can't please everybody. We know that.
Yeah. So he wrote 3 books. One was Madden America. That was his first book, particularly, right?
Yeah. He wrote a couple of other books, which are well worth reading. And right now I have one of them here, but I can't see it and I can't remember the title.
But in the area of journalism and psychiatry and social advocacy, doesn't he wrote 3 of them? Anatomy of an Epidemic, Madden America, and then one other one.
Psychiatry and the Influence.
Psychiatry and all fantastic.
More technical in some ways, but he gets into issues of the reliability of diagnoses and how a lot of the science has really been taken over by the drug companies. So
yeah. Very interesting. I don't know who told it, but somebody told it. I'm not saying that this is fact. This is just what I was told in the mid 90s, that somewhere that conventional psychiatry was on the ropes as part of, they couldn't get any respect, et cetera, and then came along the deal of, hey, we'll help underwrite your psychiatric journals, and then became the partnership that we see where we have journals that sometimes look like they're more psychiatric medication advertising than they are, looking at fundamental research. So the Madden America, which was the first book, has then blossomed into a nonprofit science journalist advocacy project at a website called maddenamerica.com. You were the director of education for that. Tell us a little bit about your experience doing that and what that entailed.
Yeah, Bob and I had gotten to know each other, and he felt like I was the person that could put into practice one of his dreams, which was to do a continuing education project. So we started that, I think, in about 2004. And the website is still up there. If some of you want to take a look at it, Google Madden America Continuing Education. There are about 30 presentations. And some of them are in fact, most of them are the leading non-pharmaceutical thinkers, researchers, practitioners and people with lived experience. One of my favorite ones was we did one on informed consent, one of my pet peeves. And I bookended it with people with lived experience. I wanted them, first of all, to tell what their experience had been with getting informed consent if they were prescribed medications. And then I ended it after I had some people, I think Dr. Sandy Steingard and a few others that I'm not remembering right now. And then we finished it up again with the same peers to talk about what they heard. So that's an example. Some of them I was able to get continuing education for credits, CEs. I couldn't get continuing medical education credits, but for most of them I got CEs. That was kind of a pain in the ass, actually. The accrediting organization loved what we were doing. They said, there's nothing else like you out there. But it was, they had to follow all kinds of rules and regulations from the American Psychological Association. So, I had to go in and put learning objectives, post tests, and all this stuff. But you don't have to take those. You don't have to pay attention to them if you just want to log into them. Some of them we had fees attached. If any of you want to take one, just email me and I'll see that the fee is waived.
What kind of participation did you have, and who were those people who were attending? Were they doctors? Were they survivors? Were they therapists? Who were the audience that would populate these continuing educational seminars?
Yeah. I think all of the above, probably more on the people who lived experience end, but I think there were more and more people who were in the clinical world who were starting to pay attention to this, and were starting to get it. And I remember on one of the webinars, we had people from 13 different countries. So it really went international.
So here's a out of the blue question. If you were scheduling, say they wanted to say, hey, Bob, we need you to set up three seminars this spring. Maybe, given time and everything, you couldn't do it yourself. But if you had 3 subjects, what you think would be imperative in the next 9 months or 12 months that ought to get out there to the community, what do you think those 3 topics should be, and who should do them? Just this helps people seed their mind about, subject experts or important thinkers on the topics.
Well, I think one of the first ones I would do one with people who lived experience, talking about what their experience has been with the system. Were they listened to? If they were, how did that work out? Did anything come of it? Because it has to be more than words. I mean, it's easy for bureaucrats like I used to be to say wonderful things, but it's another thing to really do it. I probably shouldn't talk about this, but Oregon State Hospital claims to be a recovery-oriented hospital, right? Have you all heard that? Do you believe it? So a couple of people, and I can't mention their names because they're worried that it would come back to haunt them, but we put together a scorecard. And I think we picked out 20 or 25 items that if a hospital was really recovery oriented, what would it look like? What would they be doing? Not what they're saying. So we have a little tool out there, and I can't tell you that, and we scored them on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 to 5, depending on whether we had 25 or 20. I can't remember now. And I can tell you that Oregon State Hospital did not score real high. So I won't go further than that.
This is the Oregon State Hospital that was memorialized in Ken Kesey's book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Is that right?
Yeah, and I have a whole bunch of things that I'm working on regarding that. Ken Kesey got to know Dr. Dean Brooks. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Dr. Dean Brooks. People know him because he was in the movie. He allowed the film to be produced there. I think they were there for 2 or 3 months. They involved patients. A couple of patients were actually in some of the scenes. But Ken Kesey really was not a big fan of state hospitals. But Dean, Dr. Brooks, he and I spent hours and hours and hours together talking. And what he says is that the movie really shouldn't be interpreted only narrowly as about state hospitals. It's about any place where power is part of the equation. And I think, I think that's a good way to look at it more broadly. I'm working right now on something that we will hopefully post on Madden America, and it's a history of Dean Brooks.
So Dean Brooks was the administrator of the old state hospital that was on the Salem campus in Salem. He was the administrator of that hospital for how long? And he was the administrator at the time when the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was being filmed. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was there. He started as a psychiatrist after being in the South Pacific and in the Veterans Administration Hospital in Southern Oregon. He went to work in Oregon State Hospital as a staff physician in 1947, the year I was born. And in 1955, he was named superintendent. He was superintendent from 1955 to 1981, 26 years. Wow. That's an incredible length of time.
That is.
Yes. And not fired. I mean, frankly, these are politically sensitive jobs, but he had a way of relating to people. I mean, he was on very close terms with Tom McCall, Mark Hatfield, Bob Straub.
Previous governors and senators in Oregon.
Yeah,
wow.
Right. Yeah. So, and, I've shared an early draft of it with Bob, and Bob wants to publish it really badly. I'm working with the family right now because I promised them that I wouldn't publish any of the stories they had asked me to sit down with him and write unless they were okay with it. So it's in that stage of things right now. But what Bob Whitaker says about him is for his time, he was a radical. One of the first things that he did was he started the Superintendent's Council. He had as many as 75 patients coming to the council meetings. And there's a lot more detail that I can share. Hopefully we can get the family, the three daughters, to kind of get through whatever process they're doing to edit it, do fact checking, etc. So
very interesting. He led through a time of previous to the internet, previous to turning our state psychiatric hospitals into maximum security prisons, or at least feeling like that, where they,
Kevin, one of the things that he presided over was the coming of Thorazine. And one of the questions that I asked him, I said, Dr. Brooks, what did you think when it came along? He said, well, we all had really high hopes because we were doing a lot of awful things to people. So of course we started putting people on it. And he said, one of the patients we said was a hopeless case. He'd never be discharged. We put him on Thorazine. 6 months later, the staff came to me and said, Thorazine has worked a miracle. We're ready to talk discharge. So Dr. Brooks, being who he was, he pulled the patient aside in the hallway and he said, Thorazine has worked a miracle, apparently. We're ready to talk discharge. And the patient looked at him. He said, I've been cheeking him the whole time. Dean's comment to me was, he said, so who in the hell are these medications for, the staff or the patients?
It's very interesting. Huh? That's very interesting. I was in the state hospital system in Oregon in the mid 80s. We were able to take outside trips to the community and do some outdoor recreation. And, I was on a different campus, but to some of my friends who currently work within the state hospital system and people who've been in there as patients or inmates, it's a different world. It seems highly regimented and highly regulated, and the sense of community and the sense of healing. I don't know if there ever was one significantly, but from what my compare and contrast, I think we've moved into overdone it with the sense of needed safety and the needance of adherence to the treatment protocols. And unfortunately, my biggest issue with that is the treatment protocols means that they have one thing for you, and if you refuse that, then they're going to make life very difficult. It's very unfortunate. I do think that there are a whole lot of other things that are impacting us in society and culture. We see, according to the guy who runs the Oregon Health Authority, we're seeing more people in extreme states, and there's more of them. There are more people at a highest, I don't like the word acuity, but a highest level of challenges and circumstances, and there's more of them all knocking on the front door or being led to the front door of our acute systems and our state hospital systems, as if these systems have something that's meaningfully going to impact their lives and move them on a consumer-centered journey of wellness, choice, and education. Because a lot of times it seems like we have one answer for you, and the rest is pretty bare bones. We'll make sure that we'll get you your Abilify or your Zyprexa, but having meaningful connections in a community or finding housing supports that meet your needs and that aren't punitive or aren't coercive, I think we have a long time ago. And it's my fundamental belief that we're not listening to the people who recovers or who are on a path of wellness. Oftentimes, and I have significant frustrations with the state of Oregon, there's 200,000 of us on the Oregon Health Plan. Every time they want somebody for a talking point, they don't pluck them from the traditional route or their traditional journey. It's usually somebody who broke out the side door, got connected to self-help groups, or, found some spiritual or an emotional, got a dog or developed a best friend, and they moved far further down the road of wellness than the traditional, what most people are getting. And it's very interesting that I'm not reflecting that this system and the way they put together their treatments and their lack of choice and their force recovered me. And it's in spite of those things why I abandoned the system, and with friends like you and other people charted a road less traveled. But it's interesting that those people are then being plugged into, hey, why don't you make an advertisement for our community systems, but stay free of this word, that word, this word, and that word, because we don't just, by the way, do not, Bob, tell us what the word iatrogenic means. I learned that from David Oak 35 years ago, but I find that's a very interesting word that I think the system is unconsciously does not want to recognize.
It's a disease or a set of symptoms, or however you want to think about it, that's actually caused by the treatment.
Yeah. Very
Hey,
interesting.
let me go back and say one thing. Dean Brooks was not a perfect guy. Okay, so don't try to read me that way. He was far ahead of his time, and I think he's far ahead of where we are now. But there are things that he did that I'm not sure he would keep doing. Maybe he would. He's passed away, but there were things that I wouldn't think that he did everything perfectly. He did one interesting thing, though, in terms of freedom of patients. He started a mountaineering program, and he took patients out into the mountains with doctors, and there were times when he had patients were holding ropes that were protecting the psychiatrists from falling off the cliff. So, and again, I'm sure there are criticisms that could be made of that too, but he did some pretty unusual things for a superintendent in the 1950s and 60s. So
I was at the state hospital. We went on a Depot Bay fishing, a boat out to watch whales. I've had friends that worked at the state hospital system and took people on 7-day camping trips, rafting trips on rivers and stuff. Like, none of that happens anymore. That's all been, that outdoor recreation stuff has all been kiboshed for public safety issues. It's really unfortunate. I also think that if you treat people in certain ways, if they're dangerous, unpredictable, and can't be trusted, I sometimes think that you set up your institutions to push those buttons in people in a way of like, why, I don't trust you, and I don't trust the system, and I don't believe you. And I think it's I think it's unfortunate. What we need, and what I believe we need, is not more hospitals and acute care beds. What we need is more meaningful community that is less giving people pathology and telling people, recycled science from the 1970s about, that they have a Zyprexa deficiency in their central lobe, so therefore they take this and cure it, and bingo, they're on the road to wellness. I think that undermines all we know about child development, trauma, poverty, sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and all the other things that come into making a person having challenges. So
hey, Evan, I just saw a statement that what we need are more pure respites, and I'm going to put you on the spot now and let you say whatever you feel.
We need to, when I first started this, and I was very inspired by David Oakes and the whole system. I want a revolution. I want to fundamentally change the whole system. in one day. But the more older I get and the more humility, hopefully I find little by little, I realize I think we're going to have to do this piece by piece, little bit by little bit, and celebrate our achievements. And so instead of hoping to change the whole monolith or the whole Leviathan, little by little, I want to develop and support projects that can tell a story contrary or different to what the rest of the system has been saying. And if you get the system to buy in and support some of those projects that are new or anomalous or maybe in somewhat risky, and you have new narratives coming, narratives that are coming out of that, people telling this, the state of Oregon has never recognized that there's some in-between land between I'm struggling with my moods or my thoughts or my visions or my experiences, but no, I don't need to be locked in a white room injected with a powerful, neuroleptic, but maybe I could use psychological and emotional supports to help keep me safe and take a time out from my crappy living situation. And so fundamentally, we're building another landing pod for people who are in psychiatric or psychological emotional distress with no, except, you can't be violent to the people, but no force. We're not here to tell you what you should do or what you have to do, except, keep yourself safe and keep the other people safe. And I think we're going to hear stories about people who found out that was exactly what I needed. I didn't need to be locked in a psychiatric ward. And it will start building, what David Oakes always talks about, mutual self-help and support is the way to go. We can't rely on paid friends. I mean, thankfully, you were a paid friend to me and now have become a friend, maybe because you retired or maybe because, I just didn't give up on it. But I think fundamentally, we can't, love and community and wellness and acceptance is not going to come from one QMHP and 15 minutes every 6 weeks of seeing a guy who gives you 8 pills and says, here, take this to snow your cerebral cortex. I really think community and connection are fundamental. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is there's been a lot of development, some wonderful stuff. There's a project called Inner Compass by Laura Delano and talks about withdrawing and safely withdrawing and understanding psychiatric withdrawal. There's been other projects for years, like Marianne Copeland has been trying to split the difference of help with the Wellness Recovery Action Plan has been a tool out there on the ground for some people. What do you think? Lately, we've seen, and one of the things that's been very intriguing that got a whole lot of our attention, I think here in the West, was what was called open dialogue. And some of the processes and functions of that had been quite interesting, except the problem I have is that we, like peer respite, to get that project out, I don't need to marry that to a brand that there's trainers that have a copyright. Some of my frustrations with some of these things, and it's not that open dialogue in the research doesn't really make me smile and feel like that's really wonderful, but the entrance fee to training people on this form of something, and then it's owned by by one company, makes it really difficult to try to sew that around where people don't have training budgets. How do we split the difference in some of these things when we know peers and consumers and survivors and even junior level clinicians aren't going to have access to this just because of the costs? How do we import some of those ideas with not sort of, trademark or copyright violation of somebody who's owned the turf, so to speak?
Those are great questions, Kevin. And frankly, I don't hear many people asking those questions. Okay.
Well, that's why I was a little nervous because I think the open dialogue and some of the principles and ethics of it, I just think are fantastic. I just think the entrance fee to some of those exorbitant costs right up front my goal is to take new ideas and inject them into like a fresh river into a stagnant pond. But some of those things come with eye-raising price tags. And I'm trying to get people who've been stuck in their ways, for 50 years since Dean Brooks first got his job. And so I wonder what, do we need more finesse? Do we need some middle ground? How do we approach stuff like that? Because I don't want to impact people's ability to make a living, but I also want to be realistic that I'm not going to be able to get the public mental health system to spend a lot of money on stuff that they've never done before. And it's, especially if the price tag is more than a couple $100.
Yeah, I think open dialogue is going to limit itself by the very issue you're talking about. It costs too much. And if there's some way to adapt the concepts, the ideas into more of the public setting, that'd be great. I wonder too sometimes whether we've gotten enamored of the certification process. Uh, I've been looking at it for a person here in the neighborhood because she's a recovering uh, addict and she wants to go into working and she's looking at being a certified peer specialist, whatever the terms are here in Oregon. But I was looking at some of the trainings are $1,000. And for people who want to go into that, I'm not sure they're going to always have that. Now, I will have to ask Mike Libachek and some of the others who are actually putting these things on and see, did I misread that? Maybe I did, and I'm open to being wrong. I hope I am wrong. But if that's
Well, the nice thing about that particularly is there's significant goodwill from the state and larger agencies and PROs to make available subsidies and scholarships for people who want to do that.
Yeah,
the biggest,
that's how it's going. Yeah.
Your interesting point about, certification, I'm all in favor of supporting, peer services and peer work. But one of the things that I find somewhat is if your interest is in wanting to become a clinician, then try to, and then if your first job on that ladder becomes a peer role, please understand that when you're taking a job and it has definitions, we can't, stepping out of that or not doing fidelity to that role not only damages that as far as your service to your customer, but also damages that to the future of having, social determinants of health peer support workers out there in the first place, i.e., I don't know how many peers, particularly on the addiction side, that I've talked to in the last 3 years that I'm glad to go and help make sure that people in the unit are getting their meds. I feel it's my duty to report violations of sobriety to the case manager because I want to help the client. And not that those important issues aren't important in a clinical team, but also to understand the role and responsibility and what lane you're in. You're there as a guide and an advocate and somebody to support choice and the voice of the customer. You're not there to be an ambassador for this so-called mental health treatment or to not, to want to play junior clinician, but only getting paid $3 less an hour. That's not right. It's not a good job fit for you. And peer managers should know that or correct that or encourage people to move into positions where they can be a clinician if that's what they want to do. But they shouldn't compromise the integrity and all the work that it took to even get the state to set up this program. I think that needs continued monitoring, or we're gonna despoil the whole peer services movement without having firm lanes around that. What do you think about that? Sarah, did you have something to interject?
I did. I just wanted to do a brief time check. We only have 7 minutes left, and we've got some questions from the audience. And so let me just start with the one that seems to be the quickest one to answer. Then I'll take them as the order they came in. Bob, an anonymous participant wants to know, what's the difference between an administrator and a commissioner?
Okay. Well, I think commissioner is the more traditional role, but in other states, administrator is probably the term that's used. Some of them say director. So I think commissioner is more of the old-fashioned term, probably.
Okay. And Dan McLean would like to know, what is your assessment of the project response team in Portland?
I don't have any data on it. I'd be more interested in hearing how it's worked for people. But so I don't know. I mean, the concept seems okay. I mean, if we can keep people from ending up in the criminal justice system or killing themselves, yeah, I mean, I'm open to seeing how it actually works. But again, I'd like to see some data on it. It's probably out there. I just haven't seen it.
Okay. Brooke would like to know, how is the acute care unit in hospital setting program working, and how could I get something like that happening in the state of Montana? I love that the case managers are peers.
Well, the acute care units that I helped develop had an average length of stay of 8 days. And what I used to say was that you plug them and you drug them and then you let them loose. You can't really resolve most crises in 8 days unless, particularly with a traditional mindset, unless you really force the medications onto people. So I've sat back and said, I'm not sure if that was such a good thing to do. I think it really has to be thought through carefully. I'll just say that, because the tendency for mainline psychiatrists and mental health clinicians is the old style of doing things still, I think.
Okay, Brooke would also like to know, how would I begin to go about creating positive change in the mental health system in my community?
I don't know. Kevin is doing one model of it. He's reaching out to legislators. I think Kevin has done more than anybody that I know of in making contact with commissioners, with legislators, and developing credibility and having really good ideas. I mean, that's where the whole peer respite stuff came from.
Yeah, I think that Bob also made a community scorecard, which I think is also a wonderful. I would suggest everybody take a look at the community scorecard. How would you know if your health system is getting people to recovery or something? Both of those, I think, were wonderful. Each question could lead you on, well, maybe we need this service, or maybe we need to be liberated from this onus, coercive, project or something. I think there's a whole lot in that. I think particularly is that you need to sort of be clear and in what your ambitions is, and then have a realistic expectation of size and perspective and ability to achieve it. Because if you can never get it across the finish line, I have friends that want me to get rid of psychiatry, particularly to outlaw child psychiatry. I don't have the political power to do that. I mean, I don't. But then to them, I'm a sellout because I haven't destroyed the institution of psychiatry. First of all, I couldn't, if I was trying to do that and also trying to create consumer leadership jobs or change managed care contracts or create peer respite, I don't think they would let me in the door. So sometimes people feel like I've been somewhat co-opted in trying to support the system to pay for, activities that I find, more beneficial. I sometimes think that's where we get into the civil war is, you're supporting psychiatry because you're not working 100% to completely destroy it. I think it's important to be realistic of how much political capital I have, or we have, or the movement has. And too bad David Oakes is in here, because I know that he struggled with this, and met him in the old days when he's in the parking lot with a microphone in front of the ECT people or in front of the psychiatrists, letting them know. And I love that. But also I've seen him, at times work with the state consumer council and give them support on certain sort of things. And so I think it's a kind of a nuanced approach, but I don't think in some of this work, and it as well with some of the feedback you got from the continuing education stuff, you're not going to make everybody happy. And there are a lot of powerful voices that may disagree, and that's all good, but it can be, kind of difficult when you're the one getting the arrows in the front or the back. So,
Bob, did you want to add something to that?
No, I'm kind of in the same place that Kevin is at, and I don't expect that everybody's going to agree with me on things that I've said here or elsewhere. That's just part of the thing. And I don't want to sound too new agey, but I think we all need each other. I think we've got to listen to each other and not polarize like's happening in the political world out there. That's pretty dangerous stuff that's going on out there.
Good point. I'm sure there's a couple of questions we weren't able to get around to, and I have some myself, but we're running out of time. I'm thinking, judging from the feedback so far in the comment section, we could stand with some more interviews like this. So if both of you are open to it, I hope you'll be guests at a future webinar. This has been most enlightening, and I really appreciate your time. And this has all been recorded, and folks will get a link to our YouTube channel where we will upload this. And thank you very much for everybody for being a part of this.
Thank you so much, Sarah and MindFreedom, and thank you, Bob, for your leadership and your wisdom. And hopefully would love to get more, to dive deeper on some of these topics, particularly, informed consent, And, and if we're not 100% in, how do we build community where we don't completely agree about everything? Because some of these things I think are consequential,
Yeah.
we could do a whole podcast of why people die 25% earlier than the general population, I think, which we get snowed on what the real facts say. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here today and talk to you, Bob. And thank you, Sarah and Ian and David and everybody else associated with getting this podcast going. I appreciate it.
And thank you all. I'd be happy to come back if you want me to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.